I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Jason Storm. He's a philosopher, historian, and the Francis Christopher Oakley Third Century Professor of Religion at Williams College. He's also the author of several books, including Metamodernism, The Future of Theory, which we'll be talking about today. Jason, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yeah, thanks.
I've heard of postmodernism. I've heard of modernism. Metamodernism is this newest wave that we're in. Did you coin that term?
No, I first came across it in the writings of a Nigerian-American art historian named Moyo Okadiji. And he was writing about sort of diasporic art in Africa. It's a compilation about diasporic art from the African and Jewish diaspora. And he was writing about how certain diasporic artists intentionally try and subvert and mess with the categories of both modernism and postmodernism. And the term he used for that was metamodern. But I came to it kind of as a way to produce something new. So he was using it to describe an existing set of artists who didn't call themselves metamodern, but he had some interesting things to say about it. And for me, I wrote this book without an ism in the title. I was actually against isms, and the working title of the book for most of its history was Absolute Disruption. But when it went out for peer review, folks started asking me to, I was talking about and defining metamodernism as this thing I was working through in past. And so the readers wanted to know what ism I stood for, or they wanted to give me to provide a more portable formulation that they could engage with. And so sort of playfully thinking back upon having read Moyo, a decade earlier or something like that, I took inspiration from that and used that term. And some other folks have used it that I have since come across in not necessarily the same or even compatible ways. Although I think what almost all of us who are using that term today use it for is to describe some kind of posited position that comes after the dominance of something called postmodernism. And so metamodernism is something after that. But it's kind of a placeholder. And in my case, I wasn't trying to describe a paradigm shift so much as trigger one. But in order to do that, I was trying to work through what I was calling postmodernism and trying to define with more precision than that term normally gets used. And then talk about what it would mean to kind of shift the conversation in the humanities and social sciences in a more constructive direction. Yeah.
What's the precise definition of modernism, postmodernism, and the historical timeline in which they unfolded?
Yeah, great. So in the first case, and for my conversation about modernism and modernity, I would point you to the book before this one. It's called The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences. In that work, I was interested in how Europeans came to not only identify a certain notion of historical rupture, but came to describe it as a defining feature of their cultural moment. So the idea is kind of like some dudes in Europe, basically German philosophers initially in the 18th century, started arguing that they had experienced a kind of radical rupture and that they were now in a new period, basically. But what that entailed was fraud. It was like a model in search of its own antecedents. So basically, what did that rupture? Was that rupture the scientific, what we would call a scientific revolution, or the Renaissance, or was it they were talking about the Protestant Reformation, or the history of printmaking, or the rise of late stage capitalism? All of those are very different things, but they called all of them under one name, modernity, and imagined that it's what set Europe apart from the rest of the world. As I argued in that book, it's not a very good description of Europe. It actually, it's sort of self-refuting, and it was a very condescending and colonially motivated account of the rest of the world. But alongside this notion of modernity as a period, different artistic and philosophical movements claimed for themselves the ism at the end of that word. So they called themselves modernisms. And interestingly, they meant often very conflicting things. So modernism in literature in France, for instance, was often associated with realist literature and a kind of psychological interiority, whereas modernism in the English-speaking world often was associated with figures like James Joyce and like chain of thought, sort of what we would now almost want to call postmodern narrative forms. And those two things didn't meet with each other very well. And but all that is to say, there are conflicting notions of what it meant to embody the modern. More specifically, shifting to this book, I start to talk about postmodernism, which emerges basically as a polemical other, basically in the 80s, late 70s and early 80s, first in France with folks like Jean-François Lyotard, but then in the United States. And then it accrues to it a whole bunch of the theoretical influences that were becoming important to humanities and social science scholars particularly in the Anglophone Academy in that period, who were being assembled kind of bricolage. So a little snippet of Derrida, a little snippet of Foucault, a little snippet maybe of Heidegger. It didn't matter that in their original contexts, these thinkers were often incredibly opposed to each other. Derrida and Foucault couldn't get along, for instance. But in the US, these were knitted together in bricolage form and taught as something called postmodernism. And so, very specifically, I mean it as a kind of academic paradigm and one that was embodied and found concretely in textbooks. For those of your viewers who know Thomas Kuhn famously was the one who described scientific revolutions in terms of paradigms. But I think what is under noticed about Kuhn's original argument is that he thought that paradigms were often embodied in textbooks that give you pre-handed versions of worldviews and arguments. And postmodernism, as I define it, was something that was born in these textbooks. It couldn't be found fully in Derrida or fully in Foucault, and it had much to do with the Anglophone reception of their theories. But then it was globalized from there. And so, very specifically in the book, I'm saying, you can define postmodernism in a dozen different ways. You could be talking about you could be talking about architecture, or I don't know, literature or films or something. But I'm mostly interested in this book, in postmodernism as a paradigm specifically taught in the humanities and certain sections of the social sciences. And that came along with it a set of pre-digested kind of philosophical notions, ideas about the relationship between language and thought, ideas about power, attitudes towards skepticism, critiques of ethics, critique of the possibility of ethics, even in a certain way, and so on. And in this respect, it served to kind of function as workaday tools for those of us in the humanities and social sciences who are confronted often with philosophical, either epistemological or ethical or semantic problems. And people would go to postmodern thinkers to solve those. So they would, want to know what language was about, and they would look at Derrida or something. And it turned out that as much good as came out of that, and it had some early good effects in chipping away at certain kinds of institutionalized norms and sort of biases built into the academy, which was very monolithic in the period before postmodernism's adoption, but it kind of ran out of steam, basically. And if you thought about it really hard, and I'm someone who started out as wanting to be a devotee of postmodernism. In graduate school, I went to France and I went to see Derrida's lectures, and I went to see Richard Rorty, and all these dudes who were at that point perhaps on their last legs, but were still significant titans. Agamben is still around, but anyway, a bunch of those dudes. But the problem was, if you were kind of very serious about your thinking, you realized that they had encountered certain kinds of impasses. They could only give us so much. And that, in fact, there were certain telltale contradictions that made them bad models for scholarship. So, unlike some people who are anti-postmodernists who just dismiss it, it's all junk and they want to throw it out the window, what I want to note is the real philosophical issues on which postmodernism rested, and then either to solve those issues by working through them, or in some cases to preserve the good things that they said, and then in other cases to dismiss some of the worst or least helpful features of that movement, especially its jargonism, tendencies toward obscurantism, and the habit that a lot of Anglophone academics developed of writing as though they were doing bad translations of French. And so for that reason, I kind of started this book working through and past postmodernism, but that's just really the inspiration for the book. It mainly attempts to be a systematic philosophy that stands on its own, intended to be a set of answers to a range of philosophical issues that are often kept separate. And part of the problem is, if we take our philosophy of language and only do philosophy of language, if we only do ontology, or we only do ethics, or we only do epistemology, we can come to conclusions that are actually less helpful than if we're able to take sometimes a view of multiple things at once. And partially it's the hyper-specialization of philosophy that's prevented people from taking seriously the impact of, if you have one idea about how knowledge works, that should change your view of what language does, for instance, or something like that. But if you think that those two are totally separate, then I think that there's certain problems that seem intractable, or what have you. So this was an attempt to do a kind of systematic philosophy that I hoped would be particularly useful to those of us in the humanities and social sciences. And then, by accident, it kind of got called Metamodernism. And anyway, yeah.
This may be due to historians like yourself giving us these packaged macroscopic views, but it's interesting to me how, in addition to these paradigms in science and in philosophy that you're talking about, you see different types of isms across a variety of fields, like you mentioned, like in art, in architecture, in film, And they all seem to follow the same patterns. So before I learned about modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism, and philosophy, I saw it in art and in film. You see memes about this, like the banana duct taped on the wall is postmodernist art, and you go back to modernism, and even before, and it's like very structured and realistic and following more rigid patterns. And then postmodernism, at least in the art world, seems to be about breaking all of that. I guess you see a similar thing in philosophy. I'm more familiar with philosophy of mind and the ways that it connects to cognitive science, but you see the same thing, this realization that everything, even down to perception, is fundamentally altered by our subjectivity. There's like an infinite way you can interpret the worlds. There's an infinite way you could perceive even just the photons in front of you. And there's an interesting overlap between, I guess, this postmodernism you're talking about in philosophy as it folds in into developing computer science, developing understandings of neuroscience, all throughout 60s, 70s, and onwards. And then now it seems to be that there's this rebound. And this is where I first encountered the term metamodernism and your work. It was from a YouTube video, and it was analyzing film. And the basic idea was you have early movies, very modern, and it's following a pretty rigid structure. Like you have the classic Westerns, there's always a good guy, a bad guy. It follows a fairly linear plot. And then beginning in the 80s or so, you have these postmodernist movies like Pulp Fiction, and it's following this nonlinear storytelling, and it's breaking the fourth wall. There's some irony. And the commentary in this video was now every movie is postmodern in that way. There's constantly breaking the fourth wall. The audience knows it. They know that what the tropes are, the modernist tropes, and they know that there's going to be some sort of subversion of that. But it's almost like it's been so saturated that there's this nostalgia for returning to modernist themes. And that was the argue, at least in this film world, that we're seeing something like metamodernism that describes more recent movies.
Yeah, I mean, and there are things you can see with that kind of typology and things that are get obscured by it. And you would, like it works well for memes and it works in certain ways as first pass analysis. And I think, and then then you always can come up with the exceptions. Fourth wall breaking stuff in early cinema that precedes the 1980s, or Rashomon, for instance, which is a multiple perspectival film by Kira Kurosawa in the period that normally people would want to define as modernist or whatever. But you can still talk about patterns, and I think it can be useful to hold up those patterns. And at the very least, even if they're not taken to be like universalized in terms of periods, but we're talking more concretely in terms of concrete exemplars and how they influence each other, then I think that kind of stuff can be very useful. And there's also been a historical cross pollination between the arts and the philosophical discourses. So people probably don't remember this, but there's a whole series of early novels that referenced logical positivism when it was dominant, and now those novels are not that interesting to people because that's a kind of defunct philosophical movement, basically. Although it had its legacy in analytic philosophy and philosophy of mind and other places, but even so, there tends to be back and forth or influences, and so just as yeah, anyway. So yeah, we can call the next thing whatever we want, kind of. And one of the things that I'm kind of excited about is, at the very least, working through in past what were the dominant philosophical and cultural movements of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, where it's clear that at least in academic disciplines, something called postmodernism was dominant, and I think in the arts there were certain shared similarities with the postmodernist philosophical discourse, even as there were many exceptions. So, for instance, Cornel West famously discussed the ways in which African American communities were left out of even the discourse of modernism, much less postmodernism. So, or we might look across the globe at different ways in which there are various resistances to what could get called modernism that often didn't fit neatly into the notion of postmodernism or what have you. But anyway, yes, hopefully we're in a new moment, though. There's definitely something that happened, and it may be just generational, but in that generation of the 80s and 90s, 70s through maybe the early 2000s, and the cultural political zeitgeists of the period. And for those of us who were educated and coming to consciousness at the end, or in some cases beginning of the or after those periods, it's a little bit a shame because in many sectors of the academy we keep flagging the like the dead horse of what is it of postmodernism, basically, in one way or another. So, it's in 2016, people were, for instance, saying, oh, post-truth politics are all a fault of the French or whatever, the French invasion or something. And it was just totally silly, but also it showed how a lack of interesting philosophical interlocutors for the current moment, and beyond a kind of pop culture celebrity intellectuals like Steven Pinker or what have you, who, despite his early and useful work, has since gone on to say, to do basically stuff that isn't very serious, I don't think. So, or economists, or even worse, right? So you have a lot of our pop intellectuals are economists and are pretty incapable of reckoning with broader cultural and political shifts. Anyway, yeah. So um, I'm glad you came across this work and term, and I've been really delighted at how the reverberations it's had, especially outside of the academy. One of the things that tends to happen is that things mutate the farther afield they go, and I think that's lovely. That means people are making them useful, and I'm committed to my own fallibility and a kind of humility, and letting the project of metamodernism spin out and do its own thing in ways that I didn't originally intend it. But and I'm not the only one, again, to use the term early. Moyo before me and some others between us. Yeah.
I'm curious about the direction that these terms spread and the direction of this cross-pollination. Oh, I know that to some degree it's going to be bidirectional every which way, but the schema that I have in my head that I want to run by you and see if there's any merit to it is something like you start to see provoking the boundaries in a creative way in the arts. And then after enough of that, that it sort of catches on and becomes its own theme, the commentators or the historians start to reflect on it and write about what is this trying to do. And then after enough of that happens that it's really a thing, the philosophers start to analyze it in a normative sense. Here's this new wave that the historians have documented, but is it good? How does it philosophically compare? And then once the philosophy makes an impact, then that starts to trickle down into the culture and into science and reframe the way that things go. So the key psychological idea here is that these things don't start out necessarily as philosophical worldviews, but it's more just like creative, pushing the boundaries, even in unconscious ways. And then people later, maybe decades later, start to analyze what might have the psychological motives or historical motives been here.
I mean, I think that that's a plausible account of some of these movements, although I think in some cases we actually have a tighter ligature between the philosophy and its commercialization. So, for instance, there's a famous sociological work. Kauppi is a Finnish author. It's called The French Intellectual Nobility. And he talks about how he's a little bit overly cynical, but he talks about how the rise of Foucault and Derrida and similar figures was made in part by changing consumptive markets for intellectual production in France in the 1950s and 60s, and how basically new things like radio interviews and television interviews in the post-war period, print magazines, etc., worked to produce a new market for public intellectuals that framed themselves alongside the avant-garde. And so you have, for instance, Jean-Luc Godard talking about Foucault, and Foucault writing about, talking at least about cinema. And so they're kind of influencing each other in a way that shapes kind of what they're doing. But it's also the whole reason that we know about dudes like Foucault, because after getting big in France, they subsequently became imported into the United States, often in French literature or culture departments, etc. So, and I think there is a propensity. So I think that there are two pressures. So within artistic markets, we could say that there is an emphasis on, the economics of art production tends to reinforce two kinds of movements. It tends to reinforce a certain kind of novelty, but a novelty within recognizable genre or commercial niches. So, for instance, high art, which is art dedicated toward museums, tends to try and push certain boundaries, but increasingly, for instance, a lot of contemporary museum culture is interested in the description on the art. So it's the narrative that the art is telling about itself. So high art, for instance, is often a commentary on art. And that's what seems to get you into a museum these days. So we have a museum near me, Mass MoCA, the other end of the state from you at the moment, where a lot, you have art that's like, I don't know, it's like painted green canvas. And in the bottom, it says, this is the color I see when I look out my window thinking about climate change or something. and whatever, but it's all about the text. It's the self-referentiality about the art. But there's a different phenomenon that goes on in mass art, in consumptive and pop art. So, for instance, this is the reason, because a commercial cinema, for instance, takes massive amounts of financial investment. Basically, that's why everything turns out to be sequels. Because basically they want to pre-market, or they do comic book adaptions or video game adaptions or something. It's all, I don't know, the Frogger, the movie or whatever. I mean, I don't know, whatever, some stupid arcade game that someone has nostalgia for. It's because they don't want to innovate too much. And in fact, innovation provides can be a disincentive for moviegoers. Tellingly, what happened in the 1990s in the history of cinema is that there was a change in distribution networks made possible by VHS tape production that allowed independent studios and independent films to have a brief moment of livelihood as alternative venues. And then you get the appearance of people like Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino, and they're able to do playful and creative commentaries, often though they're constrained by budgets, and so they aren't able to do giant big blockbusters back then with special effects, etc. So they play with the narrative or the narrative framework. So that those sets of developments, I think, are both can be independently analyzed from those in philosophy, and so and but they crash into each other in various places because, for instance, you have people in picking up what are trendy philosophy books and turning them into films. So, or like the Wachowski siblings picked up the Baudrillard and a little bit of Descartes and made the first Matrix movie, basically based on maybe reading the first chapter. I mean, it's very limited philosophically, but it's inspired by philosophy or something like that. So, but academics are also constantly analyzing and trying to discuss what's happening at large, and people are trying to grab big names. So anything that seems like a mass movement, people both want to bandwagon and often co-opt. So, modernism, for instance, was heavily contested. As I noted at the outset, a lot of different groups wanted to be the modernists. It's just that they had different ideas about what being a modernist meant. Postmodernism is a little trickier because it was mostly used negatively initially. So nobody wanted to be postmodern. They were all like, no, I'm not a postmodernist. That guy is over there. But metamodernism, again, seems to be a movement which people are opting into to some degree, more or less. But we don't know how long that lasts, or what criteria people will use for adjudicating membership. Because so anyway, so I think that's the kind of, I mean, we could talk about it. I've been giving you a sociological account. We could do an intellectual history account. We could do a philosophically deeper account. But I want to emphasize to your viewers the contingency of the categories, and but also the excitement that something new is happening right now. And partially, one of the things that's making it possible are new distribution networks like YouTube and podcasts that allow different kinds of input and different access to the intellectual sphere. And so it's probably not accidental that the changes in the Medium platform are permitting different kinds of philosophical materials to get out there, and then they'll be transformed in unpredictable ways. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of Socrates being arguably the most famous philosopher and being told by the Oracle of Delphi he's the wisest man, and yet he says, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
And that seems sort of postmodernist. Like, I don't know if it's a misreading to say he might have been the earliest postmodernist, but I'm surprised that if they're rejecting these overarching earlier philosophical narratives, that's more of a negative thing as opposed to championing it and saying, we're going back to our roots. Don't you guys remember? Socrates knows nothing. Knowledge is inherently unknowable. We're biased by our own human perception and so forth.
I mean, I think that there were some postmodernists, and after a certain point, it became a movement that people bought into, although they often used different self-descriptions. They often describe their methods. So deconstructionists, for instance, which was a term that's deconstruction starts with Derrida, fundamentally, but gets picked up by so concretely a group of people at Yale who formed a movement called Yale Deconstruction and launched Derrida. And they named early progenitors. They were like, they claimed Nietzsche, for instance, who they thought was cool. Everybody wanted to claim Nietzsche after a generation of everybody bashing Nietzsche. So then they wanted to claim Nietzsche. And then, now there's another round of people bashing Nietzsche again or what have you. And sometimes they went back searching for their own earliest progenitor. And so given the richness of philosophical materials, more often people said Heraclitus is the first postmodernist if they wanted to say positive things, but you could have said that about Socrates. You could have said that about Chuang-Tzu if they had had a better sense of global philosophy. It's in that respect. What I want to suggest is that there are perennial philosophical problems, and sometimes those get grabbed or adopted by various movements. but the problems often precede those movements, and very rarely, but occasionally, we get solutions or new problems. And so, yeah. Anyway, so I think that in that respect, Anyway, yeah. And I think the payoff, and I want to emphasize this to your viewers, of metamodernism is not. I mean, I think what people are using it in the pop culture arena is the periodization, which is fine. But for me and for any of your listeners who might go on to be academics or even people who want to kind of grapple with more serious philosophical issues, we don't even need any of that. So, like, that's why, calling this book Absolute Disruption or, The Future of Theory, what I'm really interested in is producing uh non-bullshit, if I can use that expression. You can bleep me out if you need to, versions of answers to real philosophical questions. And I'm using that term bullshit, I should say, in the mode of the American philosopher Harry Frankfurter, or Frankfurt, who described a bullshitter as someone who doesn't care whether what they're saying is true or false. And it turns out that a lot of philosophical thought that works to advance people's careers is stuff that the people espousing it don't really care whether it's true or false. This is especially true of that strange genre of philosophy done outside philosophy departments that we call theory. A lot of it is just functionally bullshit. There's some real stuff there, though. And so the question is, outside the jargon, what are the real issues? And one of the things I was trying to do in the book was excavate the real issues behind the bullshit, or, identify where the real philosophical problems lie, like questions about, language. What does meaning mean? Which is something fundamental. And you could associate answers to that to different thinkers, and you could try and produce a typology or chronology of it. But the payoff is more important insofar as, it matters. And so when we're doing scholarship, how we interpret our interlocutors and what we take to be meaningful signs, or, how do you know when two people in two different languages are using the word to mean the same thing, or are they? Is that even possible? Or, things like that are real issues. And so then the question is, how can we make positive progress on them? Things like that anyway. So, yeah. So beyond the typology, I think that the difference perhaps between at least the version of metamodernism I'm pushing for and versions of postmodernism, say, are that I want us to hold ourselves more rigorously to being serious about our philosophical terms and categories and their implications, and then revising them as they go along. And so building in a kind of fallibilism rather than necessarily either a self-defeating skepticism or an overly confident optimism. We just have to recognize that our categories are flawed, and that we do our best to improve our theorizing as we go along. And so, in that respect, I think hopefully, if the movement will continue, it'll change. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Well, I can see how postmodern deconstructivism is so effective and problematic for philosophy of language, of perception, moral philosophy, basically anything that has this core subjectivity component. But I don't understand why the split with the logical positivists, if you're at least just talking about math and logic, these abstract metaphysical things, because I don't know what the modern take in is in philosophy, but most mathematicians, maybe most scientists as well, believe that math and physics are discovered rather than created.
So there are two things going on there. One is about the reception of the logical positivists. And so part of the problem with the logical positivists was their assumption that you could re-engineer philosophy from the ground up based on basically logical statements that could be judged true or false. So, I mean, the defining feature of early logical positivism was the idea that if a statement cannot be adjudicated to its true, to verified, basically, if you can't tell if it's true or not, then it's meaningless. And then the idea was that you would then formulate a kind of constructed logical language starting out from basic sense impressions, and then bootstrap your way up to a systematic philosophy of the world by way of mathematics. And that project completely failed. And so almost nobody, even in philosophy, takes that seriously. There was a problem with verification built into the very structure of logical positivism. It seemed to lead toward a lot of things that are scientific claims are unverifiable claims, and a lot of things that are non-scientific could be verifiable, or even the question of how to understand time in verification is problematic. So anyway, there are a lot of reasons that logical positivism ran aground, but it also ran aground alongside a parallel problem in the philosophy of mathematics, which was around grounding, the grounding problem in mathematics. So this is sometimes called, consistency problem, that was pointed out by thinkers like Kurt Gödel and others, the incompleteness of mathematics. So basically, the thing is, what philosophers of mathematics also seem to discover in roughly a slightly earlier period that the logical positivists would have been better off listening to some of these folks a little more closely than they had, was the difficulty. Mathematical systems can either be fully self-consistent or can be fully self-consistent but different systems. And so you can have, just as you can have Euclidean geometry, which lays out a set of axioms, and it can be shown to be things can be shown to be more or less consistent with those axioms. You could also have a Riemannian or non-Euclidean geometry, which has a different set of axioms and is itself fully consistent. And so already by Einstein, Einstein had observed that the part of mathematics that we know is certain is fundamentally tautological, and the part of mathematics that we extend to the world is a description of the world. And so already in physics, the idea is that mathematics is providing a very useful set of models. And that doesn't mean that mathematics, and there are debates, there's certain kinds of Platonists in philosophy of mathematics who think of mathematics as really existing. But by and large, the debate is not, the question is sort of like, we recognize the value of mathematical models in the sciences, and they're great, but they're models. And they are models who have more or less utility based on how they're interpreted and how they're applied to the world. And so one of the things that made physics possible was not only its mathematicization, but a constant capacity to revive and modify both old, ontological, different kinds of notions about what's in the world, as well as different mathematical models. And so I think what happened was, anyway, so that's sort of, so mathematics gets you a certain distance, but it only gets you so far. And it turns out that there are many different kinds of possible mathematics. And in fact, it turns out you can't even, that every that there are always loopholes, basically. So yeah, but I think separately, there's a question about what deconstruction did to philosophy of language. So the positivist program ran around positivism also thought it was going to fix language. The difference was both positivism and postmodernism were part of the same linguistic turn. And in fact, the term linguistic turn was originally used to describe the positivists, not the postmodernists. But the positivists had already thought that the problem with philosophy was language. But the difference was that the positivists thought that by importing logic, they could fix language and solve the problems of philosophy, or at least if you're in the British version of it, doing ordinary language philosophy, what they thought that they were going to do was show that most philosophical problems could be reduced to, different linguistic definitions, and it would all be okay. And it turned out that they created more problems than they solved, and especially the attempts to produce a kind of universal meta language that would solve everything just crashed. Meanwhile, the postmodernists, setting off from a bad theory of language that was bad in a different way, they presumed often that a model of linguistics that they'd inherited from a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure. And Saussure had, in a set of lectures from the early 20th century, had done a kind of bracketing to do a new kind of language. He basically said, let's not think about the world. Let's just think about language in terms of a relationship between basically signs and concepts. And then we'll ignore the world and we'll ignore reference, basically. And then and then he argued that the meaning of concepts was dependent on their relationship to each other in different kinds of structures, of linguistic structures. So you can see how a study of grammar might lead you to think that, once you've got your verb conjugation worked out, or once you realize that there's certain contrasting categories like, color terms that are gaining their meaning from distinguishment from proximate other colors, that you have the whole thing worked out. But this was a broadly non-referential and differentialist account of meaning, where meaning is based on distinction rather than identity. What happened then was that some French philosophers of language like Derrida and company realized that produced a lot of paradoxes. But instead of thinking that meant and it led to the conclusion that translation was impossible, that the reference didn't mean anything, that words were all arbitrary, that everything was a free play of signs, that anything could mean anything else. Meaning was always being deferred in Derrida's language, both temporally and referentially, that you had to know like the full system of a language before you could know what any of its pieces meant. And all these things, instead of, I think these are all good critiques, but they're critiques of Saussure. But Derrida claimed that they were critiques of language in general. And because of that, and his followers often then, went off on this whole, produced a whole unproductive series of scholarly works and theories about language that got quite differentiated from what was happening in linguistics and analytic philosophy, all of which were running in kinds of different directions, basically. But sadly, the Derridian legacy was bequeathed to much of the humanities, if not, and a good chunk of the social sciences. And because of that, these paradoxes were kind of taken as givens, although people didn't like to think about them too deeply and went along using language as though reference was possible. And, they argued about who first came up with the death of the author, which is ironic, all that kind of stuff. All these, and they read a number, treatise after treatise about the impossibility of translation. It was often read by scholars in translation without somehow registering that that was ironic. All those things kind of proliferated, and yeah, so they ran aground. Yeah. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in this book, and a significant chapter of this book, and I think perhaps the chapter that's likely to be of greatest interest to those of your viewers who are interested in science or in particularly biology or related endeavors, is an attempt to work out a philosophy of language that takes seriously things like the evolution of language. How could language have evolved? And also take seriously the proximity of human sign-making behaviors to other proximate species, like, how do chimpanzees communicate? And or more fundamentally, what function might language have in the if we don't assume that humans are the only creatures that communicate? And in fact, and instead of bracketing off the language and the world, which is what Saussure was doing, that was his kind of first move. What if we don't bracket off language and the world, which is not to do something that analytic philosophers have done, which is reduce language to merely reference, but to grant that there has to be a certain kind of a world in which language can evolve, and that just means it has to have certain kinds of stabilities built into it. So I argue for a kind of meta-ontology, which is to say, um, basically, like, the world needs to be sufficiently clumpy. It needs to have like enough temporal stability for there to be a kind of a world in which creatures could evolve, and language could be consistent enough that part of the time it sort of worked to get some stuff done. And if you grant even that minimal notion of a world, it doesn't have to be the world articulated by, I don't know, the contemporary state of physics. It could be the world articulated by, I don't know, contemporary, I don't know, Brahmins or something. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is um, that there's a kind of world with a certain kind of limited stabilities built into it. And if you grant that and then think about how language works going through the material, instead of thinking of it as a substratum separate and indistinct from a world, but as part of the world, then you can work back up a whole philosophy of language, or a philosophy of signs, a semiotics more properly, that I call here hylosemiotics, hylo meaning matter, but it also means tree, semiotics, a kind of materialized semiotics that looks at how human sign making behavior is on a continuum with other species. So how, for instance, we can think about human signaling in parallel to the way that, I don't know, bird song signals, or the way that and to do that, it also gets us back, ironically, to an ordinary language use of meaning in English in one of its particular respects, which is to say, when we look out in the sky out there and I say, that great cloud means rain, that provides an account. That's an account of meaning. And in fact, I argue that what we think of as linguistic meaning is a kind of perception, and it's a kind of perception of the voluntary and involuntary signs that a particular sign maker is producing, and our interpretation of them. And so for me, great clouds could mean rain, but I also could be wrong about that. So, great clouds, it could be a great cloud, and I think it means rain, but actually it doesn't rain. And then I'm incorrect in my usage. And rather than, and different sign consumers then can interpret the same features of the world in different ways. So there's not one univocal interpretation, but there can also be incorrect interpretations. And all I need to knock down, I don't know, 80% of postmodern gibberish around, not gibberish, but mistaken views around language, is the capacity for one to be wrong some of the time. We don't have to have one unitary interpretation. And in fact, I don't think that there's usually one universally valid interpretation. But if there's some interpretations that are just flat out wrong, then that begins to bound the space of the possible. And then we can talk about what makes better or worse interpretations. But also we can talk about how the same individual or different individuals might get different kinds of information out of the same sign. So, me looking out there and seeing the cloud I might be inferring things about rain, but somebody else might be inferring things about the direction the wind is blowing, and someone else might be inferring things about what it's going to be like for their plane trip later that day. And those are all different things that are possible to infer from one's environment and one's surroundings. So anyway, I get into a lot more detail in the relevant chapters of the book, which is it's unfortunate it's a long and dense chapter, but we can also it also helps us think about how aspects of the world are part of our um, way of thinking, basically. And so, in relationship to neuroscience, and here I'm in conversation with people like Andy Clark and notions of the extended mind. But basically, humans do some of our thinking by way of the environment, and we don't have to have fully formulated categories in certain respects because the world is doing some of the work for us. So I might not be able to fully distinguish between, I don't know, different kinds of trees, but I can make competent reference to them, in part because there are certain features of the environment that are fairly stable, even if they don't have easy or concrete boundaries. But also, I do part of my thinking by like gesturing, by pointing at things, by or I do part of my thing by writing, or producing sounds and keeping tallies on sticks for which is as far as we can tell, some very early human behavior is keeping tallies to keep track of counting, and all of that means that part of what we're doing when we're thinking is looping through our environment in one way or another. And all the these are just little things that are possible if you don't then presume that thought and world are coming in totally different layers, or if you don't presume that language and the world have an irrelevant or unrelated, or if you don't completely bracket out the world, but only partially bracket out some of its features. And so that's one of the things that I'm putting forward in the Metamodernism book is that philosophy of language, which I've only barely touched on here, but some of your viewers will take a gander at it and see what they find useful in it. But following anyway, so and this lets us provide answers to other things that look like perennial philosophical problems, like what does social construction mean? We have a different vantage on that if we recognize that humans aren't the only kinds of critters that can socially construct things, depending on and I have to theorize what it means to be social and what it means to construct in more detail, which I do in the book. But if you think of but it means that social construction, for instance, is often materialized, and so a car is socially constructed just as a category, a linguistic category, and the construction of the car doesn't mean that it's not real. And so a socially constructed vehicle, as I note in the book, can still run you over. And so certain presuppositions or anxieties about the nature of social construction, for instance, can be dismissed in different ways. Anyway, just little snippets.
There's
Sorry,
so much to
I'm
tie in
monologue
here,
too much. Sorry, yeah.
all
So
through a cognitive science perspective. So first, I'm thinking of the trickle down effect we were talking about earlier, from philosophy into pop culture and into other areas of science and the humanities. So with the logical positivism, I th- I think you still see echoes of that in this idea of a simulation hypothesis or a grand theory of everything. And you're saying, well, at the very least, even if we could have that, we couldn't have just one. There could be multiple systems dependent on different axioms. And then the postmodernist problem there is, well, not one of them are right, and you get all sorts of logical inconsistencies. I guess you could overcorrect there and say that none of them are true or that everything is inherently subjective. And then you start to see interesting computational evidence. Otherwise, I think it's kind of related to like statistical learning, or even
yeah,
how certain video games work with fractals, or like with simulating themselves over and over again. So you don't have to code, say, a giant world. If you have a world that repeats itself, like procedural generation, then you get way more complexity with a very small algorithm. And I think there's reason to suspect that our brains do that as well, and AI does that. You see a lot of interesting patterns between developmental cognitive psychology and AI these days. So one that's really cool is in the brain you have different specializations. So like for example, there's an area of your brain that's specifically optimized for detecting faces, another for scenery, and so on. And if you look at the features in these really large visual AIs, just unsupervised learning, the features cluster together in a very similar way. So just an abstract platonic feature space, you see something that might look like the brain's fusiform face area. The other thing that's really cool is if you lesion those, so you can take a computational model, lesion it, you'll get something that looks kind of similar to brain damage, as in you could have a network where if you take out one sample of its training data, not only does it perform kind of like a human who has that sort of brain damage, but it's doubly dissociable. You could have different sections of lesions, just like you can have different brain areas damaged. The other thing that's really cool that maps on to child development is when children make sorts of overgeneralization errors of categorization, like calling everything four-legged and furry a dog. If you stop some of these algorithms midway through training, they make overgeneralization errors that still have a logic to them. It almost looks like what children are doing. So it might be the same underlying statistical learning mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I didn't know about the AI research that you're telling me about, but it sounds compelling to me. And I would frame it, in terms of some of the research in philosophy of biology, for instance, which is a train that I know a little bit better. But already back in, I forget, the 80s, there was a big debate in philosophy of biology around questions of contingency and convergence. And to basically Stephen Jay Gould in a text called Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life. No, Wonderful Life. Anyway, I forget the full title of his monograph, but anyway, started talking about radical contingency. And the question was, if we could replay the evolutionary time scale, would we end up with a totally different world, and in contrast to that, other philosophers of biology started emphasizing convergence. The fact, for instance, that many different kinds of crustaceans independently turn into crabs, famously, right? Carcinization. And so folks went back and forth for a while, but I think that the current state of, and there's been more empirical research of evolutionary biology, is to suggest that there is a little bit of both. So certain kinds of patterns are contingent. There are certain specificities that are relevant to the formulation of, particular species developing, et cetera. And you can totally have a random event that could wipe out a whole line of, I don't know, viruses or something or whatever. But there's also a tendency to converge on similar kinds of solutions, especially when confronted with similar kinds of ecological conditions. And so, when if a learning algorithm is trying to solve the same kinds of linguistic problems, it wouldn't surprise me that it would perhaps tend to converge on similar kinds of solutions to human brain development. And that doesn't mean that human brain development is fully coded in, but rather that, as you were saying earlier on, a few simple, we could almost call them algorithms, but a few simple processes that tend toward developing in a certain way that cause certain kinds of positive feedback would then often tend to stabilize in producing similar optimal solutions to similar kinds of niches. And so you can see then why, yeah, crabs keep evolving, or why you might start to develop similar kinds of linguistic processing in different parts of a network, of a distributed network. We might cluster, as you were saying, certain kinds of processing together in different kinds of distributed networks, et cetera. And I'm sure AI is a good way to explore it. I'm limited in my AI knowledge around some of those key issues, but definitely. And so, so the positivists thought that they had this universal pattern, and the postmodernists overcorrected, exactly as you say. And so now we're in a moment where we can say, okay, what things are actually contingent and what things are convergent, for instance, to keep that metaphor rolling. In terms of languages, for instance, we could note that human languages, have a tendency to have less in common than you might think. In that, like, huge vocabularies of things that people think of as ordinary and day to day. You can find languages that have exceptions to them, but nonetheless, there are some basic features like distinctions between what amount to nouns and verbs. I gather distinctions between at least every language that I think we've discovered has at least two color terms for light and dark, but not necessarily more than that. Certain kinds of things that then, seem to be parts of the consistent environment that people want to distinguish. And, the research on that is still, it's contested, but I think, Chomsky had argued for certain kinds of universal grammars, and we have whittled Chomsky down to finer, to less and less and less. But I think that there's still some things that tend to be fairly universal. And so, but their universality is probably not because they're baked in so much as that they're standard or common developmental or convergent outcomes based on a little bit of biological pre-priming. And so, like a tendency toward faces, for instance, we have I think that, there's a lot of good evidence, and you, I'm sure, know this more than me, but that even at birth, babies have a tendency to focus on faces, basically, to over attend to faces. And so with just that little bit of pre-priming, then you start to get humans who, for the most part, without something interfering in the developmental processes, can then tell faces apart. One article I was reading a couple of years ago, and I don't have the source in my head, but it was interesting, suggested that there's bilateral symmetry in many cultures in early face detection, but in the cultures in which literacy is dominant, you get unilateral distinction. So face recognition gets to localize on one part of the brain, and that
Hmm.
the recognition of words and signs recruits what was otherwise face recognition in the other part of the brain. I don't know if that's still considered good neuroscience, and it was a few years ago
Yeah,
that I
and
read it,
you
but
see not only that there's face specialization, but if you ask people, say bird watchers or people who are car enthusiasts, basically anything that has this same computational theme we're talking about of there's some sort of convergent structure like scaffolding, and then, there's variation on that theme. You see specialized brain regions really for any arbitrary thing you can learn. So like similar cluster looking for faces. Obviously, that's much larger in humans, but for these expert bird watchers or tree identifiers,
Mhm.
entomologists, car enthusiasts, all of it, you start to see the same sorts of neural specialization. And underlying that, I mean, I think it has some parallel to the procedural generation you see in video games, where you want to simulate 1,000 trees, but you don't want them to be all identical. So you have some sort of tree scaffolding that has most of the information, and then you just have some algorithm that adds a bunch of noise onto the leaves, and then they look very different for very little computational power.
Yeah, and so in a way, our brains are kind of reversing a version of that, kind of. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying? Yeah, no,
yeah.
totally. That seems very plausible to me. Again, I don't know the computer side of it, but it seems plausible to me given what I understand from the biology. And then, one of the things, when I did a cognitive science class as an undergrad, and one of the things that we read, Ellman and Bates, Rethinking Innateness. I don't know if you've come across that one, but I was then a canonical work, but showed, an emphasis on neuroplasticity, basically. So one of the things that's interesting is that it doesn't take much, limited computationally, to get very similar developmental outcomes based on certain kinds of plasticity. And so, you just need the capacity to propensity to wire things in ways to cluster them for you to start to develop, very similar effects. And so, and again, if we're thinking in terms of the philosophy of evolution, we might imagine that if we're seeing convergence between the way that humans are doing it and the way that our algorithms are doing it, it's likely that other species even, might be doing it similarly. And then lo and behold, evidence from animal behavior suggests that we have similar kinds of clustering effects in animal brains. And then the question is, if we or when we encounter non-human aliens, which I don't think we've done yet. Sorry, UFO fans, probably not. But the question will be, the guess will be that there'll be certain kinds of convergences. So, um, but anyway, but because they're similar kinds of solutions to similar kinds of problems, and there are certain constraints based on things like evolutionary cost. And so, you could develop a brain that did something very, very different, but as long as but if it only conferred, if it had a big, substantive cost and only conferred a mild evolutionary benefit, it's unlikely that that kind of brain would win out. So, again, apologies to Star Trek fans, but we probably won't get, like, I don't know, super god brain things that could instantly, I don't know, Q. I know when I was watching Star Trek, that was, I don't know. Anyway, I'm slightly out of dated in my pop culture references. But all that is to say, one of the things that I think is important in metamodernism, at least my version of the project, is taking seriously stuff like that, and taking seriously, as scholars of the humanities and social sciences, not just contingency and convergence, but even more broadly, looking at work that's happening in our adjoining fields, like animal behavior studies, like neuroscience, like biology. I mean, it's really surprising, but if I were going to be restructuring the American Academy from the ground up, which obviously nobody is going to let me do. I would encourage the human sciences to take more seriously some of the work that's happening in what often gets called the biological sciences, and I would also encourage, but and in similarly, I would also encourage more folks across the academic disciplines to take more seriously the questions about ethics and meaning and things that are emerging from philosophy and theory that are as relevant to biology as they are to the analysis of literature. But there's a certain kind of narrow specialization that gets in the way of people actually recognizing the, I don't know, the ethical issues, for instance, that their biology is encountering, or the philosophical issues around meaning, or even epistemology more broadly that any scientific researcher is going to encounter. And that stuff tends to be very thin too. So, I mean, I would rebalance things a little bit
Mhm.
differently. But I think it's very weird that those of us in the humanities, very rarely do my colleagues, are they even interested in things like neuroscience or biology or psychology? Um, and I'm like, yeah, but don't you think we're talking about people? And they're like, no, no, I just have my specialty. I only do, French literature or something. And so, and again, everybody has their own thing. And I'm not suggesting that we all become generalists and we only have a certain amount of time, but often they're asking things that are relevant, or they're presuming things like presuming blank slates in ways that don't make sense, or they're presuming notions of cultural difference without then looking at what the cultural differences actually are, for instance. And that can cause us to make different kinds of arguments. So yeah, and then the presumption that everything is subjective, which I sometimes get from my students, just it turns out to be incoherent. Certain things are subjective, but other things aren't. And you might then, once you grant even a little bit of that, yeah, that some things are subjective, sure, totally, and some things are not subjective, then we can have really interesting questions about where that line is. And I'm not trying to put it in a particular way, but presuming that everything is subjective, it's self-refuting. Is that a subjective
Mhm.
position or a universal position? If it's universal, it's self-refuting. If it's all subjective, it's self-refuting. I mean, it just doesn't work very well.
Right.
And then, and so, and a lot of things turn out to be, it's serious, and we can debate about where the lines are in that particular case. For instance, questions of qualia. What is it that's part of subjective experience that is over and independent of the, brute force of that experience? Or, they're all interesting philosophical issues, some of which I have a lot of strong opinions about, but I won't claim to have definitive answers. And I'm happy to revise my opinions in the face of new evidence. But all that is to say, yeah, for any burgeoning scholars in the humanities and social sciences that are listening, I would encourage folks to take more seriously psychology, neuroscience, and especially animal stuff, because there's a lot of great work that is otherwise happening in animal behavior, for instance, that because of a baseline anthropocentrism, people are ignoring. And on the other side, I would encourage folks in scientific disciplines to take more seriously the history and philosophy. I think it can be humbling. I think certain scientists think, for instance, that they basically have things figured out in, I don't know, whatever it is, contemporary physics. You talk to a contemporary physicist, especially someone who's, I don't know, an undergraduate physics major or something, and they're convinced that physics has completely solved almost everything important or whatever. And then you say, well, yeah, but you note the history of science, the what Larry Loudon once called the pessimistic meta-induction of previous scientific failure. And you note that every scientific paradigm that thought it was complete so far has been overthrown. And that doesn't mean that every aspect of our paradigm will be overthrown. And in certain ways, it's probably approximately true. And that's wonderful and great. And we're gaining ground in a way. So just as Newtonianism was sort of approximately true under a certain set of conditions, but you would note then that a little bit of historical sensibility would allow one to take on a little bit more humility. And then questions about evidence and how we evaluate evidence, unfortunately, they're taught in very simplistic ways in even in very serious scientific disciplines, who are basically, I get the sense from my students, are thrown into labs and just encouraged to calculate things within certain error bars. And if
Mhm.
they've got the confidence intervals, they move ahead. But whereas I think we could have more interesting conversations about how evidence works and what it means to have, what kinds of inferences, both abductive inferences that are both inductively valid, and then they're abductively ways to rule out counter hypotheses, and ways to talk about independent research chains that produce more evidence for something, all this kind of stuff. Some narrow group of us in sort of applied versions of philosophical epistemology talk about all the time, but it rarely trickles out into actual workaday practice, even though it's so relevant to all the work we do as scholars and scientists and what have you. So that's also part of the thing that I'm pushing in the Metamodernism book, is those kinds of methods for producing better, albeit necessarily humble knowledge. So, fallible knowledge. And part of it is too around communication, because I think in the sciences, um, you know, there's a strong tendency to communicate scientific findings outside to the public as though they were definitive, in ways that mislay their provisional and historical nature. And so, people are told that COVID spreads by droplets, and then we learn no, it's not droplets, it's inhaled or whatever, and then people, instead of realizing that that's just the way science works, then think it's all a conspiracy and go home. And so there's fundamental issues of communication that are going on as well as
Mhm.
within the disciplines. So yeah.
Yeah, I started out as that very physics arrogant student and then brought to cognitive science because of these philosophical issues. So that resonated really hard. Um, I want to push you more in the computational direction because I think you'll like the connection to philosophy. Have you heard of this statistical concept of Markov blanket?
No, I have heard of a Markov chain, but I don't know what a Markov
Mhm.
blanket is.
It's
How's that?
kind of related. Same guy and same concept of you're trying to some algorithm that can capture a certain amount of information. So blanket in this case is the boundaries of whatever system, and it's kind of arbitrary. It can be anything. The simplest version of it is just some uniform boundary like a sphere. So let's say the problem you're trying to solve, a statistical problem, is you want to estimate the mass of the sun. And you start off with a really small sphere in the sun's core. That's too small. You're gaining mass more and more as you expand the sphere. Eventually, you're going to get to what we would call within a certain error bar, the diameter of the sun. The problem is you're always going to have some solar flares that get out there that would give you a more accurate sense of the mass is a little bit larger. You're going to underestimate it to a certain degree. But then it connects to the Thomas Kuhn idea and really how science works in general of you're going to have some sort of probability cutoff of by the time I capture 99% of the mass or whatever your cutoff is, that's just the boundary. And then we'll say this additional 1% is a confidence interval because you could outstretch the sphere boundary all the way to Mars, and then you'll capture much closer or really 100% of the sun's mass. But then, it's all the way out to Mars and it's kind of useless.
Yeah.
So then the way to make it even more meta is then you say, aside from those sorts of confidence intervals, there must be maybe some evolved second order computation for what is the optimal amount of noise to have. And I think that's where it converges with the evolutionary biology question really nicely. And I think this also relates to philosophical identity problems like Ship of Theseus, or this question of if you remove every single cell in your body, at what point do you stop being you? Because you can take out any single one arbitrarily. But it seems like if you set up some sort of computational boundary for the
Hmm.
specific question you're asking. And every single time you do that, and every single time you represent it in your mind, you're probably posing a new problem. So, if I set up a problem where I'm just really interested in you functionally as a human being, the hair cells on your arm don't matter. So those are functionally irrelevant. You can say that the confidence interval is tighter. If the question specifically is how many hairs does Jason have, then it's like it's really important. So the thing I like, and I think it's more metamodernist than postmodernist, because the postmodernist is like there's an infinite number of questions you can ask about Jason, and you're going to get infinite a variety of answers of what are the boundaries. The metamodernist take loops back on itself and says it depends on the computation, and there's different optimums per computation. And on a more macro scale, there's probably even an optimal plasticity amount that lets you encounter the different types of complexity that you'll see within a typical human landscape. And then you can frame that in evolutionary terms.
I like it. I mean, I think it's what you're saying resonates with me, and especially in the Metamodernism book, I talk about there's this question of aggregates, or heap. It's the Sorites paradoxes, which is to say, how many hairs does a bald man have? And you say, and then you add one hair, and each time you add one hair, you shouldn't that shouldn't make a difference, but it turns out, somewhere. So one way to say that is you think there are no bald men because if he has 51 hairs, he's bald, and 50 hairs, he's bald. That doesn't make any sense. But you could either keep adding hairs or keep subtracting hairs. It depends on which direction you're going in. But you could lead to the false conclusion that there's no such thing as a bald-headed man. Instead, what I suggest in the book is that we require vagueness is built into the world. Things have fuzzy boundaries, but are the purpose for which we are um, determining our criteria for membership is determines within certain error bars or certain range the utility of a particular conceptual formulation. So from the perspective of his barber, a certain number of hairs, does count as a bald-headed man. When he's got enough hairs that he still wants his hair cut, then he's not bald. But if when he has no hairs, then he doesn't need a barber, something like that. So, it isn't to say that you ever get a single fine line, but the different scales of sharpening are articulated for different particular purposes. And it sounds like what you're saying is adding on to that the capacity of a computational model to include a kind of plasticity that covers a wider range of possible questions. It solves a kind of a wider range of possible utilities for that, you know, defining the boundaries of something, for instance.
Right.
So, and I think that sounds cool. And I would love to do more. The other thing that you brought up, which is something that I'm very interested in, and some other metamodernistas are also down with this, is questions of complexity. And I think it's something that if I had more time, or maybe, the next sabbatical I get, depending on what I get occupied with, I think that there's a lot of interesting work going on in complexity theory at this exact moment. And there was a period where people have been talking about complexity and complexity theory, significantly since the 90s at least. But now there's starting to be some payoff now that it's more computationally possible to do various kinds of modeling, complexity economics, for instance, or what have you. And I think it's going to turn out that that provides us with solutions that are neither the to put a crude periodization on it, neither the overgeneralizations of modernism nor the denial of generalizations of postmodernism. Yeah, so, and I think there's a lot of great work to be done with modeling, with computer modeling. So anyway, if any of your viewers want to team up and do some papers on this stuff, let me know. I would love to, especially someone with more computer chops than me. I did one computer science course in college, but it was a long time ago, and we learned C++, which is probably irrelevant today, and not relevant to any of the kind of real issues we would want to model. Um, but all that is to say, there's I think a lot of great work to be done yeah, computational modeling of different sorts, especially of complex systems, and looking, especially when we, I think in the humanities and social sciences, there's a lot to benefit from it. And we've already seen some payoff in the natural sciences, but we could go further, especially in the humanities and social scientific world. Yeah,
I think this is why we have hierarchical neural networks and brain systems because there's low resolution type problems. Like it in your early visual system, if you've heard of blind sight, where
yeah,
it's a condition where you can have cortical visual damage, you consciously don't see anything. That's
yeah,
interesting. But you
yeah,
throw a ball at your face, they know how to dodge or how to catch it. So it's like those lower order visual areas that are connected directly to your brain system and or to your brainstem and your motor system that can react even if you don't have this sort of metacognitive awareness. But that's interesting. And I think it's related to this idea of, well, kind of like the bald man question. You don't
yeah,
have to count how many hairs you have to tell there's a man in front of you. That's a very simple computation. You just need some sort of basic, it's not even a feature detector. It's really like you could imagine this is actually where the animal connection comes in a lot. I think some fish, their basic visual system, it basically just works by detecting differences in the amount of light from the ocean backdrop. So they don't even really see fish. They just see a dark blob that casts a shadow on whatever the backdrop in front of them is, or a light blob if the fish is lighter color. And that's enough. It's just this binary sort of detector. Is there a thing in front of me or not? And those are evolutionarily conserved in these lower order systems. And then you get like more complex cortical structures building on top of that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I like what you're saying about the importance of different levels of and of evolutionary systems and their importance. And I was also slightly distracted because I was reminded of a novel, the novel by, I think he's Peter Watts, Blind Sight. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a dystopian sci-fi novel that takes the blind sight problem and related issues around consciousness. It comes to an anti-natalist conclusion, basically, that consciousness is a bad thing, or well, at least an anti-consciousness version of it, that it would have been better if humans. It's an alien contact novel that imagines humans being contacted by an alien species that doesn't have second order consciousness at all, and then tries to imagine different variations on unconscious humans and what have you. Anyway, I don't agree with its outcome, but it's a fun philosophical novel. I was trying to remember the dude's name. I think he's Peter Watts, but it might be something else Watts, and the novel is just called Blind Sight. But if you want a philosophical exploration on a fun sci-fi way of some of those issues, totally, I would recommend your viewers check that novel out too. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think anyway, yeah, but I would agree also that there's a lot to learn from both, from comparative neuroscience, for instance, around exactly those kind of issues. Um, and thinking about what work our categories do, and thinking about how mathematical modeling or computational modeling more broadly can give us certain kinds of insights, allow us to see certain kinds of patterns, and how complex patterns can develop from fairly simple initial set conditions, or even you know uh, fractally extrapolated from fairly simple core principles. This is also stuff that, again, people were down with in the 90s, but didn't have the technology to do it. And now we have some of the technology to really do this kind of work seriously. Yeah.
There's one last big topic I want to ask you about,
Sure.
Jason, which connects the evolutionary biology to narrative to philosophy of religion and psychology. It's this psychoanalytic concept of archetypes. It's pretty unfashionable, especially within modern empirical psychology, but it was coined by Carl Jung, a psychoanalyst and a student of Freud's. And this is around the same time that in literary analysis, you see people like Joseph Campbell analyzing mythology cross-culturally. He had this book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he's talking about this thematic symbolism you see that's pretty universal cross-culturally. And Jung takes that idea, he coins this term archetype, and he's arguing that humans have this collective unconscious that's evolved and that is building the schemas that we interpret the world through, particularly like social schemas, social narratives. So like, and connecting it to these abstract philosophical questions of good and evil, and that's going to be represented in, say, an archetype of these polar opposites, let's say God and the devil, Thor and Loki, like whatever the cross-cultural variation is going to be. And generally, he takes that same idea of archetype and you can apply it to basically anything that he argues as an evolved universal pattern in human social cognition. And I think there's some interesting biological evidence for it. So I haven't seen many people put a computational neuroscience perspective on it, but the last thing that I'll say about this that I think could connect it to animal research as well, we have, there's good neuroscience research showing that humans and other animals, especially primates, have certain innate fears. So to snakes, to spiders, and in the same types of fear conditioning stimulus, even if you even if it's a stimulus that we don't have an innate fear towards, naturalistic stimuli are still learned fear. Like if you pair something with a shock in a classical conditioning paradigm, you can learn fears to naturalistic stimuli like other predators in wildlife or like fungi, like anything that looks like it could potentially be dangerous and encountered in our ancestral environment, compared to something that we still can learn a fear from, like guns or really any arbitrary object that you could pair with a shock, but you learn it ever so slightly faster if it's something that's more familiar to you. And one of the archetypes that I think is most tractable in framing in this neuroscience way would be this idea of predator. So one of the things, I think it was Joseph Campbell, he talks about how dragons are universal predator myths across cultures. And it's interesting that though dragons don't exist, humans have come up with dragons every single place you go. And what they seem to have in common in this evolutionary way is a dragon is like a semblance of all features that are naturalistic predators to us. So there's giant birds of prey, there's big toothed cats with 4 legs and claws, there's snakes with snake skin. Dragon is kind of a cluster of all those features, and it breathes fire. And we learn to tame fire, but we also know that it has this innate destructive component, and people are fascinated by fire. Primates are fascinated by fire too. There's interesting studies that show they'll just watch them. So I'm going out on a limb here, but the idea could be that the the computational neuroscience definition of any sort of archetype, like an abstract category like predator, and this helps with the philosophy of language, philosophy of categorization generally in the statistical learning way. You have sets of features and you have neural activation paired with that. And there's going to be overlap between them, but to some to an abstract enough feature, and this would be the type of higher order representation that we're talking about cortically, like how you have, well, these low level visual systems, but then you also have the high level semantic meaning of it. I think it would be a fairly abstract system, and it would be what is common across, say, all predator threats. And there's some good research linking this to hormones, which is what I study. So, like cortisol, threat response, fight or flight, stress reactivity. And then the polar opposite, these are the two that I've been able to flesh out the most, would be this archetype of, say, maternal caregiver. And there's good research on how the oxytocin system works. And you could similarly say, what is it, this set of features, even in an infant or in other mammals, that preferentially from infancy respond to certain stimuli? They respond to touch, releases oxytocin. But there's the same famous set of studies from John Balby. I don't know if you've heard of these, this wire mother
Oh yeah.
versus a real
Yeah.
mother. So,
Yeah.
you're not going to get the oxytocin release from the wire mother, even though the wire mother contains the milk. But conversely, even if it's a stuffed animal, if it's soft and tricks your sensory system into thinking this is like a caregiver, you will get that response. So that's as far as I've been able to go in connecting these things. Do you think there's any
So,
merit to that idea of archetype?
well, okay, so here's I'll say what I like first, and I'll say what I'm skeptical about first. So what I like is your attempt to kind of come up with a plausible biological, let's say even broadly neurological account of why there might be certain default, and for lack of a better word, instinctual biases toward the formation of certain categories. So, the and I think that's interesting. Where the question that one would want to ask is how universal are they? And it turns out, for instance, but just, we might have a predator response. I would find that plausible. Dragons are not actually cross-cultural universal. Most of the features of dragon. I mean, I know you both Jung and Campbell said that there are two big groups of dragon source materials. Basically, there's a broadly European version, and then there's a broadly East Asian version, but they're not really the same thing. In the East Asian context, dragons are water creatures. Historically, they don't breathe fire. They're just and they're large snakes cross culturally,
Mhm.
but then there really are large snakes in different parts of the world, so it's hard to know. Like for instance, traditionally in India, there's a category of the Naga, but like there are debates around. Sometimes those are called the dragons of South Asia, but then it turns out, sometimes that people were talking about living in environments in which there are a whole range of different kinds of large snake species, and so all that is to say, and there's also um and many indigenous societies don't have dragon categories as I understand it. So like, so predator,
Mhm.
I'm probably there with you that there's probably, I mean, I'm so there's a problem. So I don't want to say that there are no predetermined or pre-biased, pre-weighted category formation in humans. I think there probably are. And the question would be, you could call those archetypes if you want. Jung's actual ontology of his archetypes was weirder and richer than that because he had a notion of a collective unconscious, and he connected, and his particular project was connected up to a kind of Christian mysticism that, kind of universalizing Christian mysticism, and had an idea about the relationship between God and humanity. So there's all this other stuff going on in Jung's particular case. Let's bracket him out, um, but I like your intuition for looking at possible reasons why, you know, we might have built-in predator responses, and that why might that might cluster certain kinds of features together. I find that more plausible. I don't think we get us all the way to dragons, but you might still have a predator response. Um, and yeah, and then I part of the problem, and this is also the problem with Joseph Campbell too, is that Joseph Campbell. So Jung is writing in a period. Both they're both writing in periods where our source space of ethnographic data is somewhat limited, and they're heavily weighted by examples that come from basically, broadly speaking, Abrahamic historical context plus a little bit of India. So they're looking at and it turns out that if you the further field you travel, in some cases you do have surprising, interesting repeated patterns, but less than you might think. And uh, there's also an interaction phenomena. Whereas Europeans go into other parts of the world, they often ask similar kinds of questions. So, for instance, there was this idea that indigenous parts of North America had a belief in the Great Spirit. I forget now; it was supposed to be maybe it was Lakota that were supposed to have a great spirit. But anyway, tracing back a history of translation, and I'd have to check the source to get the specificity. It turns out that the term often translated as great spirit and treated by Europeans as if it were an analog to indigenous notions of God was Jesuits asking indigenous peoples who made the world. And what they were saying was something closer to it's a big mystery. And then but it was being written down like there was a great spirit that made the world. And really it's because the categories being formulated by the interaction are having an impact on the peoples who are being studied. So one would want to be very careful in one's generalizations about what categories are actually there, especially given our global world. And that's why, and there's interesting research being done exactly about these kind of issues in, what's used to be called cognitive anthropology, but is also being called cross-cultural psychology in other areas. And so it's just important that we test our presuppositions and figure out what is weird, and I mean weird in the Western, whatever that acronym stands for,
Mhm.
the over preponderance of psychological studies based on American undergrads, basically. What are actually cross-cultural. But that said, I think we will find some more common features. The other problem with Campbell in particular is that his patterns are so broad that it's like really hard not to fit things into them. So like, I mean,
Mhm.
again, it's fun reading, and I loved A Hero with a Thousand Faces when I was in high school and thought it was really cool. And it was like, wow, all really good stories are separation, initiation, return, or whatever. But then
Yeah,
you're
Star
like,
Wars followed the model, and I think it
Star
was
Wars style
intentional
model.
of George
Intentional.
Lucas.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that fits the pattern, but otherwise the pattern is so vague. Like what counts as a separation? What counts as initiation? What counts as a return? I mean, and not all stories fit that. And then you throw out the outliers, and then, it's, uh, so all that is to say, I do think that talking back to psychology, early Steven Pinker work on the language instinct, presumed certain kinds of default categories as mental modules. I forget the vocabulary behind it, but I think he and early cognitive linguists were thinking about mental modules that had that they've worked back. Like there are probably some mental modules like early distinctions not only face recognition but between animate and inanimate. Humans tend to
Mhm.
track that pretty early. But then some more specificity we probably wouldn't want to grant. Like we probably don't have bird detector. We probably more have a animate inanimate detector. I mean, I don't know. You'd have to tell a plausible story. Yeah.
There's two other things I like about the archetype concept. I don't know if it would be useful to stick with that term or not, because one is more broadly about prototype theory. So like all
Yeah.
the
In
birds you've seen in your
linguistics.
life.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's
Yeah.
like some sort of statistical learning algorithm. I think it's the source of creativity as well. Because the thing I liked about the dragon example, I don't think it needs to be cross-cultural to have this, but it's like you have two separate ideas. You have broad linguistic categories that are used to describe things that are pretty diverse, like predators. And then you have the creative spin on it, which I think there's some connection to how we create narrative, which is you take clusters from that broad category and you reassemble them in unique ways in a way that's still identifiable, say, as predator, even if it's not actually a real thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like two pieces of what you're saying, and I'll take a step back. I mean, I think prototype theory is very interesting, and there's been some great work. I'm thinking, of course, classically of Eleanor Roche, but also Lakoff and others on prototype theory. And I don't think it's fully complete, but I think it has some important intuitions. And so for those of your viewers who are interested in this, I would, direct you to Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, which is a really fun book. And it looks at how, our categories have asymmetrical weighting built into them. And so, it seems to the average person that a robin is a better exemplar of the category bird than a penguin. And why is that?
Mhm.
And, there's a lot of evidence for, that. But then the question, Jerry Fodor and others in philosophy of language folks have begun to question exactly where the prototypes are centered, because it turns out that they're not word based. So, for instance, the question of how you blend them. So, for instance, the center of the category bird, no, the category bird and the category, well, I think the one he uses is pet fish. So I'll just do that one. The when people think about their average pets, they're more likely to think dog or cat. When people think about the average fish, they're more likely to think salmon or something like that. But the center of the category pet fish is neither the center of the
Oh,
category
yeah.
pet nor the center of the category fish, but then often like goldfish or something, or whatever. So we have to think about like how the prototypical categories interact with each other. and there is room for a lot of more interesting work too. And I think you're right also how certain kinds of prototype categories recruit other kinds of default perceptual attentivenesses that, and again, I would only push you. The only problem that you're going to get if you use the word archetype is you're also going to run into too many people who are, broadly speaking, Jung had some cool things to say. I don't want to totally dismiss Jung, but who are in his broader orbit that includes people like Jordan Peterson and other,
Mm.
contemporary folks who are trying to revive a particular piece of Jung, which is an essentialization of gender, and that I think, we have they're complex conversations about the difference between sex and gender, and I'm not one
Hmm.
of those. I think that there is a difference between sex and gender, and it's worth having a conversation about what those differences are. But I think that there's a rearguard movement happening on the conservative front, which is to universalize notions of sex or something like that, to deny the existence of gender, and to use Jordan Petersonish gender or sex essentialism. What their preferred term would probably be gender essentialism, but whatever, essentialisms, to argue about the differences between men and women in ways that are um, running roughshod over both the complex, nuanced ways that we might want to talk about sex and biology and gender and culture, and that is being buttressed by reference
Hmm.
to a reading of Jung and Archetype that I think, like it's all chaos or order or something, and that's like just way too simplistic, and gender and
Hmm.
all these binaries. Basically, it proliferates these cultural binaries in ways that I think are unhelpful, and then pull us in ways that I think lead into yeah. So that's why I would caution you perhaps against archetypes as a term, but I think thinking about prototypes and physiological priming for certain kinds of prototyping, I think could be useful and would be really fun to think about. Yeah,
Right. Earlier, I mentioned my research on hormones and brain development, and a primary arm of it is brain development in humans with different intersex conditions. And
yeah,
it's the same philosophical question of like, what are these category boundaries? So many people have not heard of all that complexity. And basically, for any single feature of sex that you can think of, there's going to be one dissociable human clinical population. And also, there's animal studies to back this up where, you can have a Y chromosome, but be phenotypically female, or you can have male hormone levels, or like whatever the
yeah.
thing is going to be. You can imagine one counterexample.
Yeah, totally. And I think for some reason that hasn't slipped into our public conversation. And I think when it right. And part of it is that sex is being treated in too simplistic ways. And we have to recognize um that when we're talking even about the word sex, we could be talking about a range of different kinds of things that we're tracking biologically, or and then separately culturally. The notion of gender is quite fluid, and even what cultures consider to be "quote unquote" masculine or feminine is incredibly divergent in ways that I think would surprise people who haven't done anthropological work or lived in other parts of the world. So yeah, so all those things are there and worth discussing, and that doesn't mean that there's nothing you can say about sex, for instance, but you have to be careful about what you're referring to when you're making
Hmm.
those kinds of generalizations. And yeah, so right, exactly. And there's also this question about the way that biological categories often have require, ceteris paribus characterizations, which is to say, what used to be called monster barring in biology before we realized that that term monster was pejorative, but the notion that biological kinds tend to have exceptions built into them. And so rigid dichotomies, and there's a tendency to treat as rigid dichotomies things that are often on a spectrum. And so,
Hmm.
and then again, what we were talking about much earlier in our conversation is where we might want to draw the line at different places for different purposes. Yeah.
Right. See, I think this is why I've been drawn to archetype, but I would appreciate a suggestion if there's a better term for it. But it's this idea of, sex is a great example. Here's something we have a biologically innate category scheme for, and yet it's not a rigid thing that you can define. So archetype seems like, it's kind of vague and hazy, but I think I like that because it's like, here's in a set of features that's sort of in our collective unconscious. And I could think about that in like, this is the computational scaffolding that you're granted. I also like that for culture, it connects to Richard Dawkins' idea of memes and you get memetic evolution. So then one definition could be if you have this sort of runaway feedback loop, like you sometimes get with sexual selection, of cultural selection, an archetype could be something like a meme selected to its extreme, given whatever constraints are going to pressure in the opposite direction against its propagation.
Oh, I like what you're trying to define there at the end. I thought that was cool. I don't know if I would use the word archetype again. I think maybe we should keep brainstorming
Because I don't
to
think
have
it's
that fun.
meme either, because what we're
Yeah,
trying
and
to
it's not
put
meme
forth
either.
here is a
Yeah,
new
yeah.
category of meme that's like actually selected for. It's the same type of convergence. So like wings are convergent, or
Right.
like the crab shells that
Eyes.
you talked
Yeah.
about. Like that deserves its own term, specifically in its own like meta selection way.
Yeah, so for me, so I also have a pushback on my old pushback on Dawkins too, but I'll frame both of those. So in here, in the Metamodernism book, I talk about organic convergence to talk about various kinds of functional convergences because um I use the word organic because it's just literally a Greek word for function, but because there was a notion of functionalism in anthropology that meant and sociology that meant something totally different and that I wanted to take a step back from. But I do think that we often have organic convergences, and then the interesting thing is, convergences produce analogy, not identity. So, two different species evolving eyes aren't the same eye, although they perform similar kinds of function, or, questions about what kind of generalizations we can make. My pushback against Dawkins's memes is the presumption that memes are self-replicating. And the thing is, a point of fact, human copying behavior is always motivated. And so, I mean, yes, there's priming a little bit in basic, learning, and we do some very few unconscious imitations, like, for instance, body posture or yawns. I could yawn now and see how many of your audiences
Yeah.
unconsciously yawn, but otherwise, most things that we're actually copying, the copying itself is motivated. But in here, I talk about memetic processes, which are my attempt to, or historical kinds, which I'm working off of also a philosopher named Ruth Millikan, who has an interesting thing about the notion of, because what you want is not just copying, but you want to have copying that is motivated in a certain way, and that copying that then also has a mechanism for stabilizing the variation in that copy. And we can see this in why the notion of memes is misnamed, because memes in the pop culture arena are not identical copies. In fact, I'm thinking here of what's her first name? Shipman, I forget her first name's book on memes. What makes pop culture memes distributed is that they're copied with variation, not without variation, and that they're copied for particular purposes. And so, the meme, I don't know, jealous girlfriend or whatever, like that gets
Mhm.
copied, but the reason it gets copied is people can play with it and insert a little bit of their own content each time. And so you have both a replication and you have motivated replication, and then you have play built into it, variation built into it. And so again, that's that question about convergence or stability versus variation. But I like your the thing that you're talking about pursuing in your research, whether you call it archetype, um, maybe there's a synonym for prototype or archetype that doesn't
Mhm.
hit existing conversations. Let me do a synonym search. Let's see.
'Cause I don't think the memes have to be self-replicating, because I do like the idea that humans are the
Yeah,
sources of that natural variation. Like you take a joke and you modify it, probably most are going to kill it, just like most genetic mutations, but then a subset might make it funnier and make it more likely to spread. And then the archetypal question is, what would be the like ideal platonic form of this joke that makes it maximally likely to spread? And that doesn't have to be a metaphysical thing. It can be, how is it mirroring the specific psyche? I think that's why I'm drawn to Jung, because he's framing this as it's like a mirror of the human psyche. So it's almost like you could say in Dawkins' sense it's exploiting it. You could also just say, again, it's a human creation, but it's a human creation adapted for whatever our social needs are going to be. And just to go down the uniquely Jungian, like esoteric Christian route, like one of his arguments, and this is helpful for me understanding religion in general, that
yeah,
to the extent religious narratives resonate with people, they must be tapping into some sort of archetype. So I think what he argued for for the Christian passion is that, well, let's say the archetype in this abstract sense, like we're talking abstractly about predator, is sacrifice. Well, here's a story where, to me, I think the historical time and place, the culturally specific details are probably irrelevant. That's probably a point that Jung would disagree on, but I look at it and say, if you're trying to tell an archetype that is sacrifice for the greater good, well, the greatest possible sacrifice you could debate philosophically, is that self or is it child? Somehow in the story of Christ, it's both. And then you can say the greatest possible sacrifice for some moral good, like what's a greater moral good than to save mankind eternally? So like in that sense, the story is as extreme as it gets. And my sense is that that's what psychologically resonates more so than anything else. And then you have this
Yes.
problem of the
Yeah.
abstract versus the particular.
Yeah. See, the problem is, I mean, this is the problem with a lot of these arguments. I mean, I like what the intuition that you're going for, which is an attempt to figure out needs or psychological things a particular religious institution is deploying, but then it ignores the historical specificity of whole things like the conversion of Constantine and the specificity of Rome needing a particular institutional, in the Sasanian Empire in the same period, you start to have a turn toward dichotomous thinking and certain kinds of narratives, in part as a way to anchor the cultural conditions of late antiquity. I mean, there's all this historical specificity that
Uh-huh.
then gets lost when the things get turned into, and this is the problem with Jung too. I mean, um, you know, uh, when they're described in ways that, I mean, this is maybe with a historian hat on again. Like in the
Mhm.
philosopher hat, yes, I like your attempt to figure out what needs religion is serving in a present historical moment. And I like questions about what particular, I don't know what we'll call them, proto archetypos or whatever, something you come something better that they're utilizing. But then there's
Metatype. That's a good one.
metatype. Oh, I like metatype. Sure. Let's stick meta on everything. Yeah. So what metatypes they're deploying. Sure. I like that. But I would want to just caution that you don't end up with a just so story that works backward from the current historic conjuncture to say this is the thing that necessarily would have happened because it's the optimal, meme version, memeplex or whatever. When in point of fact, there is a lot of historical contingency um, and yeah, and when a lot of the specificity to particular features of Christian theology, might have been otherwise. Like, you know, Constantine, uh, the or like if for instance, Vienna had fallen, most of Europe, I forget what the period of the Ottoman of the invasion of Vienna, but all of Europe could be Muslim right now, and then we would be thinking of how the optimal and or let me give you something that's more a historically specific example. The story is often told, and I have to leave in a couple minutes because I have to teach class, but um, the story is often retroactively told about European cultural supremacy that has to do with some kind of universalized feature of European enlightenment or whatever. But based on scholarship, and I'm thinking of a book whose title is something like "Why Did or How Did Europe Conquer the World?" It turns out that basically what happens is because Europe was fractured in a particular way, there was a lot of internal fighting and an intense investment in military technology, specifically guns. And the moment when European guns were slightly better, not hugely better, but slightly better than the guns in the rest of the world, Europeans started conquering it. I mean, he basically
Mhm.
argues that it's not some kind of universal cultural superiority, nor is it the universal, all these grand narratives. It just comes down to a particular historical path dependency and a particular historical conjuncture in which at the right time, a certain group of people had guns that could shoot a little bit further. And, I think that historical contingency would, somebody would have done it if it weren't for the Europeans. That's probably true, but I wouldn't want to put too much pride in that. And I'm not dismissing all the values of science, all these other things, but a lot of that came later, right? So, all that is to say, there's a tendency, I think, to tell, and this is true of a certain cross section of evolutionary psychology more broadly, to retroactively describe current features as if they were things that needed to have evolved in early human evolutionary history, or as if they were universal features of the mind when they turn out to be the products of specific history. Now, but the way you're approaching on the other end of it, which is where you go, instead of working backward from current cultural dominances, you start forward from things like hormones, or you start forward from things like studies about, responses to, the famous wire monkey versus the cloth monkey, or whatever it was, fuzzy monkey
Mhm.
versus the wire monkey studies. Then you can, if you're generalizing based on those, that kind of research evidence, I think you can take us to cool places. And so, looking at, predator detection in humans, for instance, and propensities toward responding to certain kind of stimuli over others, basically based on infant behavior or whatever. I don't know. You were mentioning that research. I don't know if that's already done enough, but I could see that could lead us into interesting directions, and I would be totally down with that. But then it might not lead us to dragons. It might just lead us to noticing,
Mhm.
snakes or something, or whatever, or how those fears get hijacked by other kinds of, why everybody comes up with monsters in some more
Mhm.
abstract sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Jason. I'd love to chat
Oh,
more about our metaphysics another time.
sure. Yeah, and I'm always open to do other interviews later down the road, in your podcast, or talk more about, yeah, any of this stuff. I think it's a really fun terrain, and I think,
Mhm.
you're doing interesting stuff. So thank you for having me on your show.
Likewise, thank you for championing metamodernism.